Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. And a great crowd of people followed him because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Then Jesus went up on a mountainside and sat down with his disciples. The Jewish Passover festival was near. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said to Philip, "Where shall we buy bread for these people to eat?" He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Philip answered him, "It would take more than half a year's wages to buy enough bread for each one to have a bite." Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, spoke up. "Here is a boy with 5 small barley loaves and 2 small fish, but how far will they go among so many?" Jesus said, "Have the people sit down." There was plenty of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated as much as they wanted. He did the same with the fish. When they had all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, "Gather the pieces that are left over. Let nothing be wasted." So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of the 5 barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they began to say, "Surely this is the prophet who has come into the world." Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. You may be seated.
You've all heard of the account of the feeding of the 5,000. Surely you have. This is one of the Bible stories that every child learns, certainly by 3rd grade. So I will assume that all of you know the story very, very well. But today I'm not going to teach it as if you were a 3rd grader. I'm going to teach it in a way that you will see how profound it really is. I mean, not amazing, but profound. And I remind you that since this is reality, that this is historical, please envision, if you will, as I go through it, it actually happened. It involved people. It was a miracle, and it was a profound one. Other than the resurrection, it is the only miracle that's covered by all 4 gospel writers. Now that tells you that for God to direct all 4 of those writers, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, to record this means that it must be very, very significant. Furthermore, there's no other miracle that Jesus did which involved so many people. The second in line to this miracle would be the feeding of the 4,000, which Jesus did a little time later. Now, this miracle is not what theologians call a restorative miracle, whereby Jesus restored sight to a blind person, or hearing to a deaf person, or the ability to walk to a crippled person. It's not what theologians call a transformative miracle, whereby Jesus transforms something, say, like water into wine. No, it's what theologians call one of Jesus' creation miracles. And he did a bunch of those. He created food out of nothing. I mean, surely this miracle would have been testimony to his divine identity, don't you think? We're going to look at this miracle verse by verse, step by step in a few moments, and you'll see that it should have erased any doubts as to who Jesus was. It was one of his miracles that could not be denied. And it wasn't one that just his disciples saw. You know, the disciples have been accused by skeptics of being biased, of simply stretching stories or repeating what Jesus told them to say. Well, this miracle was witnessed by as many as 25,000 people. And when you've got 25,000 people looking on, it would be pretty tough to fake something and get away with it. You can't fake something or get away with a fabrication before 25,000 people. And by the way, there is no record of anyone who stepped forward from that crowd or anywhere else to say this didn't happen. That this miracle was a lie if it didn't really happen. Surely someone among that 25,000 would have stepped forward and corrected the story and said, no, let me tell you how this actually happened. Now, as you well know, John, the gospel writer, has already given us the specifics of 3 miracles that Jesus did. And we have seen them, we've analyzed them, we've looked at them very closely already. The first one was creating wine at the wedding in Cana. That would have been a transformative miracle. He transformed water into wine. The second one was the healing of a nobleman's son, the Roman official's son. That would have been a restorative miracle, right? We looked at that one. And the third one was the healing of the paralytic, another restorative miracle where he healed this man at the sheep gate in the pool of Bethesda there in the city of Jerusalem. Today we'll be looking at miracle number 4 in John's presentation of Jesus, and it's called the feeding of the 5,000. Now, obviously, these aren't the only miracles that Jesus did. In fact, at the end of this gospel, John, the writer, tells his readers this very last statement that he wrote. He said, Jesus did many other things as well. If every one of them were written down, I suppose that even the whole world would not have room for the books that would be written. This means that you and I are reading about a select number of miracles that Jesus did. But I want you to be cognizant of this. The people of his day would have been witnessing all of them. They would have been watching these miracles occur. Things Jesus was doing that was just absolutely blowing their minds. This would have been common stuff for them to see from the Lord. And yet we have no record of anyone accusing him of fraud, of trickery, deception, sleight of hand stuff. I mean, how could he have faked the kinds of miracles he did? How can you fake raising a dead man? You can't fake anything like that. How could you fake the feeding of 5,000 people with just 5 loaves and a couple of fish? The infamous Benny Hinn, surely you have all heard of him, has never demonstrated a miracle that didn't leave everyone skeptical, saying, what? Was that really a miracle? There's no doubt that Hinn is a fake, that he's a phony. People write about it all the time, yet no one ever said that what Jesus did was not real, not from among the people who witnessed it. Now, there were some who accused him of doing his miracles through the power of demons. But even if that had been the case, it still would have been supernatural, right? No, everyone knew what Jesus was doing was true. Everyone knew what Nicodemus knew. Remember what Nicodemus said? He said concerning the Lord's miracles, he says, nobody can do what you do unless God's behind it. There's no other explanation. Well, let's go ahead and get started, okay? We have, 15 verses to cover. We're going to go through them this morning, and I think you'll find them fascinating. Let's look at it. Sometime after this, Jesus crossed to the far shore of the Sea of Galilee, that is, the Sea of Tiberias. Sometime after this. Sometime after what? Well, sometime after all that had happened in the previous chapter of the things we had just seen. By looking at the other gospel accounts, we know that it would have been anywhere from 6 months to a year later. The earliest 6 months later, but it could have been as much as a year later. He had just finished Passover. It could be a year later because it's Passover time once again. Chapter 5 ended with Jesus being in Judea, down in the south, where Jerusalem was. He's now up north in Galilee. Now, why was he up north in Galilee? Well, he was doing his Galilean ministry. But you need to understand that many scholars believe that he went up there because the Jewish leadership was hot on his trail. They had already said they wanted to kill him. Jesus had just learned that John the Baptist had had his head cut off. So he's gotten away from the frenzy that was going on in Jerusalem. He knew that if he had stayed there, he was going to be killed. So he's gotten away. I mean, they were eager to get him back in Jerusalem. What's my point in telling you this? He was on a divine schedule. Don't forget that. He was on a divine schedule. Therefore, it wasn't time for him to die. It wasn't time for him to be put on the cross. And therefore, if he stayed in Jerusalem, they were going to kill him. And so he moved out of Jerusalem and he went up north into Galilee. He's in the region called Galilee, and Galilee has one major body of water. It's called a sea, but really it's nothing more than a lake, but a very, very huge lake. I have had the privilege of being there on that lake on 2 occasions. But this lake, or this sea in Galilee, was named the Sea of Tiberias. Now, to my knowledge, its name was not, nor was it ever, the Sea of Galilee. It wasn't the Sea of Galilee, it was just the major body of water in Galilee. It would be like me talking about the river in Alexandria. Well, there may be several rivers, I don't know how many there are in the Alexandria region, but if I say the river in Alexandria, every one of you, 100% would think what? The Red River, of course. Well, the Sea of Galilee was the major, large body of water, but the official name was the Sea of Tiberias. Tiberias was a Caesar, as you know. But in the Old Testament, it was not called the Sea of Tiberias. In the Old Testament, when you're reading it, it refers to that sea as the Sea of Gennesaret or the Sea of Shinneroth. But by the time of John's writing, at the end of the 1st century, the name of it had been changed to the Sea of Tiberias. And that's because the main city on the shore of that sea was Tiberias, which was named after the emperor Tiberias. So John is simply right here. You see it in parenthesis. He is just parenthetically telling his readers that the Sea of Galilee by this time was no longer the Sea of Gennesaret. It was the Sea of Tiberias. Okay? Simple enough. Let's keep going. Verse 2. And a great crowd of people followed him because, and this is key, why were they following him? Because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. Folks, do not forget, we're talking about 2,000 years ago. This was a very primitive culture. We wish to be critical of the people following him because the writer says they were following him for one reason, for what they could get. But this was a primitive culture. The other gospel writers, because I told you all four of them write about it, they tell us that Jesus went to the other side of the lake by way of boat. John says the people followed him. The other writers say he went by way of boat. So how did the people follow him if he was in a boat? Well, easily. They would have followed him by the shoreline. And often when people were simply traveling, that lake was so unpredictable. Storms would come up just like that. And I experienced one on my first trip there. Just out of nowhere, a storm. So many times the people who were crossing the lake, even though it would take longer, they would follow the shoreline. They would keep the shoreline in sight so that they could get to ground if they needed to in a hurry. That enabled the crowd to follow Jesus. They followed the shoreline. Actually, Mark tells us that that's exactly what they did in chapter 6, verse 33 of his book. Therefore, the people kept his boat in sight, and they followed. Matthew adds that the people started coming from the villages all around. So as the people were traveling, as they saw the crowd, that crowd attracted more crowds. And so people started pouring out of the little villages, joining in on the crowd, following them alone. Why were they following? Well, because they saw the signs he had performed by healing the sick. As I said, do not forget that this was a very primitive culture. The people wanted healing. There were always people who needed healing. There were all kinds of diseases prevalent, and there were no cures in that day. There were no vaccines available for the people. So the population suffered, and they suffered greatly. Most people died at a relatively young age. There was no such thing really as a correct diagnosis of one's illness. People didn't know what it was. It was hopeless for the sick. But here was a man who could actually heal. They were overwhelmed with this. Oh my God, this man can heal the sick. This man can do anything. Well, Jesus gets to the other side of the lake. And when he gets out of the boat, look what it says he does. He went up on a mountainside and he sat down with his disciples. He was simply trying to get away with his group, these 12 disciples. They had all just completed a span of ministry. And so I'm sure it was a time to discuss what had gone on, to discuss what was going on in their families, what they had done, what they were going to do, and so forth. John, the writer, tells us the Jewish Passover festival was near. Well, he says that to us. Why did he mention this? To explain the reason for the next verse. When Jesus looked up and saw a great crowd coming toward him, he said this to Peter: where are we going to get bread to feed this many people? What are we going to do? In Matthew's account of the story, he says that the disciples had already told Jesus to send the people away so they could find something to eat. Send the people away. It would soon be dark. But the people kept coming. There were crowds and crowds of people who would have been on their way to Jerusalem for the Passover. You see, the east shore of the Sea of Galilee, where Jesus was a main traveling route toward Jerusalem. So people would have been coming from everywhere, and they obviously would have been hungry. You know, you and I today take eating for granted. Everyone in this room knows you're going to have food for today. You may already know I put out a few steaks to grill tonight. I know what I'm going to be having this evening. I already thought about what I'm going to have for lunch. We're talking about a culture where people were constantly under stress because the average family did not know what they were going to eat that day. Life was about finding something to literally survive. These crowds who have been burning up energy following Jesus obviously would have been hungry. So Jesus asked Philip where they could get food to feed everybody. And that indicates that these folks had no intentions of leaving. Obviously, they weren't planning to take off. They were following Jesus, and so Jesus knew they're going to be staying. Look at what John adds here. He asked this only to test him, for he already had in mind what he was going to do. Jesus was testing the disciple Philip. How, you ask? How was he testing? Jesus was testing Philip to see if Philip would acknowledge that Jesus had the capability of feeding these people. He was fully capable of feeding everybody. Jesus was wanting Philip to say, well, Lord, you can create food for everybody. Why send us out searching for some when you can take care of it? But this is not what Philip said. Philip answered him, it'd take more than a half a year's wages to buy enough food for each person to have one bite. How are we going to do that? Well, as you can see, Philip didn't pass the test, did he? No. He actually said, this is what he literally said, it would take 200 denarii to buy enough food for each person to have a bite. And 200 denarii, scholars say, would be equivalent to the average person's wages for 6 to 8 months. 6 to 8 months. So over half your salary is what would have been required to feed that many people. You know what the Lord was doing, in my estimation? He was presenting to these disciples an impossible situation. This is an impossible situation. How can we feed everyone? Well, duh, we can't. We can barely feed ourselves. How are we going to feed this many people. And then look what happened. Another of his disciples, Andrew, Simon Peter's brother, he spoke up and he said, here's a little boy with 5 barley loaves and 2 small fish. But how far will that go? One theologian says it's very, very possible that Andrew was being sarcastic. There are 25,000 people. Hey, here are 5 loaves and a couple fish, Lord. Maybe he was being sarcastic. The gospel writer Mark tells us that Jesus had told the crowd to go in, had told the disciples to go into the crowd to see if they can find some food. And by the way, the barley loaves, I don't want you to think of loaves of bread like we have in our cupboards at the house. No, it was probably nothing more than hard slices of bread, more like biscuits, actually. And the fish would have probably been pickled fish. So Andrew has this little boy who's carrying 5 biscuits, a couple fish, and then Jesus says this: have all the people sit down. Have them sit down. They're going to be comfortable because we have a lot of grass in that place, and they sat down. About 5,000 men were there. John the writer tells how many men were numbered. Now let me ask you, if there are 5,000 men around, you generally find women around, right? And if there are women around, there are children around. And most theologians agree that there would have been, in all likelihood, 20 to 25,000 people. I mean, that would be a Trump crowd, if I could throw that in there. A massive crowd. A massive crowd. So Jesus told the disciples to have the people sit down. Mark tells us in his gospel that Jesus didn't tell them just to sit down, but he said, put them in groups of 50 and in groups of 100. You say, why? Why would he have done that? Well, dividing people up into groups would make it a whole lot easier to distribute the food. You would know this group right here has already been served. The line here, they're taken care of. Let's move to this group and let's move to that group. Jesus then took the loaves, gave thanks, and distributed to those who were seated. How much? As much as they wanted. And he did the same with the fish. Without making a scene, okay? Without the clap of thunder, Jesus just started passing out food. And the amazing thing is, he wasn't taking food from this one to this one to this one. He just started passing out food. And it was never ending. As he would pass it out, he would create more. Folks, he was creating this food. This wasn't bread that came from grain. These weren't fish that came from the sea. He created this stuff. Can you imagine how it must have tasted? I would say that the bread tasted exactly as bread is supposed to taste. I don't know if it's like ours today, but if Jesus created it, that bread tasted like bread was supposed to taste. And that fish would have tasted exactly as fish should taste. It would have been the best ever, right? And the people got as much as they wanted. When they all had enough to eat, he said to his disciples, gather the pieces that are left over. Well, nothing wasted. Nothing wasted. So they gathered them and filled 12 baskets with the pieces of high barley loaves left over by those who had eaten. Listen to me. Do you realize that this was a precise meal? The precision of this meal was absolutely amazing. What do I mean by this? Well, Jesus had created just enough for everybody without there being any waste. Or let me put it this way, without there being any actually left over. None, there weren't any leftovers. Really, you say? Well, read that again, Ken. No, it says the 12 baskets full that they gathered. That wasn't waste. You know why that wasn't waste? How many disciples did he have who had not yet eaten? I'm certain that they're the ones that finished off those 12 baskets full. After the people saw the sign Jesus performed, they said, surely, wait a minute, surely this is the prophet who is to come into the world. Who is this guy? Who is this guy? Over in the Old Testament book of Deuteronomy, Moses wrote that book, remember? Moses speaks of a prophet that was to come. He was to be a prophet greater than Moses. If you read in the book of Acts, Peter announces to his listeners, he says, this is Jesus, the prophet spoken of by Moses. The prophet was to be the Messiah. So after these folks saw Jesus do this undeniable, this marvelous miracle, they knew that he must be the prophet. They were in the presence of the Messiah. I'm sure they had chills. In the same way you would if Jesus appeared over my shoulder while I was preaching. It would give you chills. They knew this was the prophet. I mean, they were thinking, here's the guy who can feed us all the time. Here's the guy that can heal us of all of our diseases, who can take care of us when we're sick. They realize that, look what they do. Look what they do. After the people, Jesus, knowing that they intended to come and make him king by force, withdrew again to a mountain by himself. These people had decided, we're putting him in charge for sure. We are going to make him our king. They were going to do it by force. Why? I would put it this way, being the good Republican that I am, Clay, being the good Republican I am, they were wanting to create a welfare state. They were wanting to create a welfare state. Jesus could do all the miracles. He could provide all the food. He could provide all the health care. He could provide all of that at no charge. He could provide all their wants. And look what Jesus did. It says he withdrew. Why? Listen. He had not come to provide for their temporal needs. That's not the reason he came. But that's the kind of king they wanted. That's not the kind of king, however, that he came to be. And that's still the case, folks. That's still the case. Jesus doesn't acquiesce to everyone's cries for health and wealth. That isn't a right for everybody. It isn't. And we can't manipulate him for our own selfish ends. People are not called to Jesus for what they want. They're called to come to Jesus for what he demands. For what he demands. He calls on sinners to mourn over their sin, to be penitent, to acknowledge him as sovereign Lord. He calls on people to be obedient to him, to live for him. In fact, to die for him if necessary. And when these same people learned of what his message really was, and you'll see it in John's gospel, guess what they did? They turned on him. How dare you? This is a right. Food is a right. Healthcare is a right. Meeting our needs so we can be content and happy and full. That's a right. No. They wanted a king of which Jesus was not going to be. Unfortunately, it's not the kind of king most professing Christians want today. Like I said last Sunday, when you start preaching what Jesus demands of his followers, what happens? People will scatter like roaches when you flip the light on. I heard one preacher say that the default position of all unbelievers is provide me this, provide me that, give me this, I have a right to this, I have a right to that. What can you do for me? That is the default position of all unbelievers. But the default position, he said, of all true believers is, Lord, what can I do for you? What can I do for you? And folks, as unpopular as it might seem, that is how Christians are supposed to be. That is true Christianity. Lord, what can I do for you? We'll pick up with verse 16 next Sunday and see what happens. Stand if you will, please. Father, we thank you, Lord, for your word. Please help us to understand it and not to manipulate it to say what we want it to say. Help us to understand it. But more importantly, help us to apply it and to live it. And to do that, we know that we will need your help. Help us to do that. Increase our faith. Help us to keep on keeping on. And for that, we'll be grateful. And now, may the grace of the Lord Jesus Christ, the love of God, and the communion of his Holy Spirit be with you all.
Also with you.
God bless you, folks. Love you. Have a great, great week. See you next Sunday.